Hey Josh, how's it going?
Hey, not too bad, Jonathan. It's been a great session so far. I've been enjoying all the content.
I appreciate you checking it out and seeing the conversations and everything, and I appreciate you taking this time. So, Josh, everyone can tell on the screen you're a principal product manager, but why don't you talk a little bit about what that actually means and what you're working on here at Ninja?
It can mean a lot of different things depending on the day, but ultimately, I am responsible for the identity and access management areas of NinjaOne. More explicitly, the permission systems, our integrations with single sign-on providers, fancy other things that I can't talk about just yet that are coming, that are on the roadmap. But ultimately, I work with our customers and understand what the needs are and bring that back to our engineering teams, prioritize it and build it, and ideally ship it quickly with as few bugs as possible. But that's really the life of a PM. I also oversee our MDM or mobile device management area here, which is something that if you want to learn more about, reach out to me. We are in closed beta today, so would be happy to get other customers involved in that. But I'll stick more towards some of the identity and access management pieces as that's the topic of the day.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that context. I mean, and everyone I'm sure can understand why we wanted to have you talk about this session, have you on. And just to back up and talk about your role, one thing that I think a lot of people in the community and maybe folks here in the chat can attest to is you're very accessible along with the other product manager friends. You're very careful about providing dates in terms of features that are coming, and you love to provide a tease of like, oh, things are coming soon. But you guys are always very accessible. You're quick to jump on and answer questions. So really great resources. One of the places that you can do that is in our Discord. So we'll drop a link to that in just a second. But Josh, going back to the topic of the day, right? So we had Evan touch on a few of these things that they're seeing at Red Canary that are common in terms of attackers abusing credentials and gaining privileged access. You got to see some of those things, and you've done some research yourself. I'll let you just get into your presentations because you put together a good one.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And there will be a little overlap, and I think it's for good reason between the previous sessions and even some later today, just to make sure everybody really is hearing where the threat really is. And I would say, and I'll get into it more in a moment, with the kind of increased use of SaaS applications, your on-prem area of concern is definitely still there, but now you've got another vector you have to worry about. And dealing with credentials locally in the cloud in an identity provider introduces a lot of just extra work that you've got to pay attention to and things you need to worry about. So I'm happy to kind of talk through today explicitly kind of one of the things I want to talk about just to make sure we level set with everybody is what's happening in the wild right now, what's happening in the market, what's happened in the last, say, 6 months or so as far as breaches, incidents, and how do they relate to credentials and credential abuse. Why is that explicitly important, especially for this audience with various MSPs, corporate IT, large and small? It doesn't matter. It's all very relevant. We'll get into that. And then what are some of the high level general best practices? We only have 25 minutes or so I can't go into deep detail on how to solve all the problems, if you will, or at least mitigate as many as possible with inside a Ninja. But we will talk about a couple, and we've actually got one of our community members on. I won't spoil it just yet. I'll leave that open as a teaser to help show off how they use Ninja to help secure their environment. So more importantly, what's going on in the last 6 months or so? And I wanted to highlight a couple different breaches or incidents that happened recently, and specifically ones that were related to in some way credential access. And in this one specifically, Activision had a breach which ultimately spawned from a phishing attempt that was done via text message. So it wasn't an email like we were talking about before, which is one of the most common vectors. It was a text message that was sent to a user who then, unbeknownst to them, clicked it, was presented logon page, and typed in their credentials, giving it to the threat actor, which, as everybody knows, you see different text messages come in, you get spam phone calls, you get spam email, you have to deal with it in all walks of life. And not everybody is well versed in that. And it is something that is bound to get someone. And in this case, they gave up their credentials From what I understand in this specific incident, it was a username and password. There was no second factor or multi-factor authentication code that was provided, but they gave their credentials. And it doesn't matter how complex those credentials were. It just matters that they copied the exact right password and gave it to that threat actor. And they were able to then go in and exfiltrate sensitive employee data and information about yet to be released games and actually send that out to the public, which from a marketing team, from a business perspective, imagine the hype they were probably going to put around those things, and we're now kind of late to the game because someone else did it for them. That's a lot of risk to a business. And one of the things as we talk about these three different incidents, I wanted to highlight was that there are some possible mitigations that could have helped either reduce or prevent this act from happening. And the first one is really if they had multi-factor, it doesn't matter the type, if they just had a second factor beyond the password, it's likely that that would have prevented some of the exfiltration from happening or the initial access from happening. So we get into credentials and just a username and password, that can go a long way in some organizations. Unfortunately, you really do want to have a way to protect your devices, your critical systems with that second factor or even multi-factor authentication tokens. Additionally, and I believe this was talked about earlier, was the access policies and conditional access and allowing users to get access to systems, but making sure that they're following the policies that are put in place or put policies in place to prevent it from happening from areas you don't expect or from unknown areas. And even still, if you're dealing with systems that are critical in nature or applications that are critical, maybe those supply a different type of access policy and you want to add an extra factor in there. Think about those things. A lot of times this could be seen as an end user experience problem, but ultimately you've got to weigh that or balance that with the data that is being accessed in those systems. And then of course, and this is going to be a common thread we talk about, is training, informing end users, informing the business on how different attacks take place. You've got to entertain them a little bit in how you do it, not just your simple phishing emails that I'm sure everybody is used to, but rather really educating everyone on how attacks may happen and go from there to really help them train and understand more. The next incident or breach that happened recently is one that's also not related necessarily to password complexity, which a lot of individuals and a lot of what used to be the common thing to do from a password policy standpoint was you need a 20-character password and it needs to be complex and you'll never remember it, and you need a hardware token to even create it. But that doesn't do any good if that password is reused or is leaked in a different data breach because of another system that gets identified or accessed. So in that way, complex passwords are great and they help reduce the time for brute force attacks, but honestly are not the end all be all to saving everything. And in this case, bad actors were able to get access to usernames and passwords that were previously leaked. And then they used a method called credential stuffing, where they just tried a bunch of usernames and passwords and ultimately got access to the PayPal systems under users' credentials that were valid. So it's also really difficult to know when something like that is happening, that it's a quote unquote breach, which is why the impact here is unknown. But again, back to multi-factor. I know my personal PayPal account has multiple factors. I hope everyone else's does here too, whether it be SMS or hardware token. That second factor is going to help, but also notifications around access from a new location. Those things should be turned on just so you're made aware. And again, this goes back to educating folks on how to use those things. But again, credentials can get left behind somewhere, and I'll show that in a moment, or they could be accessed inadvertently by a threat actor or from someone trying to. In that case, you really have to make sure your end users are trained on how to handle those situations, resetting their own passwords, and setting them up for success with specific password policies. The last one I wanted to talk through here was around the Atlassian breach that happened in February of this year, where, and I mentioned this a second ago, a password was unfortunately put into a public repository. And in doing that, that password was active, had a user account attached to it, and these threat actors were able to access a facility system that users use to look at their office space or interact with other users. And as such, the threat actors were able to get access to employee data, were able to actually get access to floor plans for the different offices at Atlassian. This wasn't a quote unquote breach by way of force or vulnerability, but rather public credentials were left publicly available and they were used maliciously in that way. It's unfortunate, but things happen. And again, if you had a second factor in there, if you had access policies preventing access from certain locations, and if you had proper training potentially in place, a lot of these things can be brought up and at least checked for. So why is this important for everyone here? Well, there's been common attacks across small businesses forever, but they are continuing to increase over time, whether it be credential theft and malicious activity to get credentials like LSAS dumping and things of that nature, or it's phishing and social engineering. Usually your initial attack vector, as we talked about earlier, is some way to get credentials, and then you get on the system, and then you're going to dump all the other credentials that are there and cached, which by default on a Windows desktop system, I believe, you're going to have 10 cached credentials that are left on disk and in memory. You want to be sure to change that and reduce that down, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then also another thing to highlight is that of all of these cyber attacks that in a recent study Accenture did, 43% of those attacks were targeted towards small businesses, which means attackers are changing their focus in a lot of ways. Instead of going for very large organizations all the time, they're going to smaller organizations. And the thought there from an attacker's mindset is that they may not be as well equipped to handle those types of events or those types of activities. So they think it might be an easier win for them. And that's why we're here talking about it, to help make sure you're well prepared in the situation that may come up, or even try to mitigate it as best as possible. Moving forward, oh, look at that. We've got Stephen Murphy's here trying to go on a little fishing expedition. But I don't think we're going to let Stephen Murphy get access to any of our credentials. We know better than that. We're not going to give him our username and password. So what can you do? Well, you've got a couple things that you ultimately should do. And as I mentioned before, we won't have time to go through a full playbook of how to best manage, secure, and set up your environment. But more specifically, I can give you a couple high-level pointers. And the first one is identification. You've got to identify what are your admin accounts, the accounts with admin access to devices, to systems, etc. What are your access locations? What's your external ingress points? Do you have websites that you have to manage? Do you have VPN access? What are those different entry points into your systems? And then from there, you want to identify what are your critical systems? What are your critical applications that you really need to worry about and make sure that you're maintaining? And then also your critical accounts, your VIP accounts, understanding where those are, what do they have access to, and so on, to really allow for other parts of your configuration to take place. You'll see here, and this is really the power of Ninja, with a couple custom fields, you're able to go in, and we already provide you the last logged in user, but beyond that, you can have a script run at logon that immediately tells you, does the logged in user have admin rights or not? And you can show that right within the console. So when you're troubleshooting, when you want to do reporting, those things are right there front and center. Again, bringing in that extensibility of what we can provide you that additional context. Next, you want to not just identify, but you want to identify and then use that information to then better secure your environment or environments that you have under your management. Patching and updating, that's a broken record. I don't have to tell everybody here that you should do that, and you should stay on top of it on a monthly basis or even more frequently than that. You want to enforce proper password policies as well. And it's not always about length and complexity, but also when a account is failed to log in X amount of times, you want to disable it. You don't want to allow it to continue. Sometimes disabling it for, say, 15 minutes or so, which is what's initially recommended for non-admin accounts by the Center for Internet Security, is the first approach. So that way, if anybody's trying to brute force an account, they're going to be disabled from doing that for at least 15 minutes, and they'll likely move on to another account. And then it can re-enable itself automatically. You want to limit on the devices that you have under management the number of cached credentials. So if someone does get access to a device and they try to run an LSAS dump, the amount of data that they get access to is very limited or almost none on that device. And if your logged in users are not using admin permissions and they only have local device access, not administrative rights, and limited rights to network shares, then the lateral movement risk once on a device is very low as well. So again, limiting your cache credentials, limiting what the users have access to will help negate some of that risk that you might have. And I think Jonathan mentioned this before, some of the scripts that we're building out and wanting to release. This is just a small view into some of the templates that we're building and delivering, where you can better secure your environments with these types of scripts, whether it's disabling local accounts, disabling SMB v1 and weak TLS. So again, you can remove some of these vulnerabilities and risks, setting configurations on those devices. It gives you a little bit more control over your environment. So once you've identified and secure, you need to monitor. And that is one of the things I love best about Ninja is the extensibility at which you can monitor your devices, whether it's looking for failed login attempts, locked accounts, unexpected access locations, so where a user's logging in from, event logs, more importantly, looking at group and user changes. So is a user disabled? Is a user being added to a secure group? Unexpected account usage as well. These are just views of NinjaOne being able to provide you access to event log data coming from whether it be Active Directory or your local device, telling you whether a user's been added to a group, whether a user's been disabled or created or not. If you're not doing this today, this is something you should really be looking at to figure out, can you and should you be monitoring these types of activities throughout your entire managed estate? And then lastly, you want to defend. So defend is going to look very similar to secure in some ways, but it's kind of that back end loop. You want to, if something happens that's triggered from your monitors, you should probably look at locking your accounts, forcing your password resets or MFA resets, updating your access and password policies. So as you learn more, you're going to need to iterate and iterate based on what you've learned from activities or events in your environment. And then, of course, user training. So continue with that. The more you learn, the more you should then train your end users and help them from that. So really, you've got 4 major high-level steps: identify, secure, monitor, and defend. But what I want to do next is actually hand it over to Michael Mason, who can show off the capabilities of Ninja, but how they're using it at his organization for securing local accounts.
Yeah, and we'll see. We'll hopefully we'll have Michael in. I know he was having we're having a little bit of issues getting him on board. But while we're waiting, and hopefully that's able to happen. But while we're waiting, I just want to share a link because this is a discussion that I've seen people having in a few different places. So you've heard us talking about the Ninja Discord server where people are sharing scripts and answering questions and things like that. But we also have the dojo, and the dojo is our community forums. There's also a script share section there as well. That's also where the documentation lives. It is only accessible for, you need to have a Ninja account to access it. But I'm going to drop a link here because Craig Cram was a Ninja user who actually first shared a simple lapse kind of alternative solution using device custom secure fields. And he shared this first back in 2021, but has since updated about a year ago. And some folks have been commenting, what's great about the community and about the dojo and also the Discord server is everyone's able to go in, test out stuff, make additions to it, make revisions, share thoughts. And so there's a great thread there. If you are a Ninja customer, you can access that. And we can also get a discussion. We can share a version of the script in the Discord server. So even if you're not an Ninja customer, you can look at that as well. I'm guessing with the timing and everything that it looks like maybe we're having trouble getting Michael on.
That's fine. So
yeah,
I can talk through. I can talk through what Michael's content is doing, and I'll post a link, or I have a link on the slide here. But ultimately, what Michael's team was able to do at his organization was, well, first of all, and I don't know how many of you are in this situation today, but ultimately, looks like, oh, yep. So we're moving forward. So just making sure that he wasn't going to jump on at the last second. But yeah, so what his organization was able to do was build out content that's linked here that allows for them to automate every single day the update of the local admin password and store that securely within Ninja. So if you needed access to it, you could see it within the console, but it would constantly be changing, and every device would actually be getting a different password. So very similar to what you would get from Lapse with Active Directory, but you don't need Active Directory. You don't need access to a domain controller or anything like that. It's all handled and self-contained within Ninja, really allowing for a bit more flexibility depending on the type of environment you're dealing with, and also less setup and configuration in dealing with a more traditional Lapse configuration from Microsoft. So I definitely ask you all to take a look at his content. To feel free to bring it into your environment as a script that you want to run. I've ran it myself in my personal lab, and it seems to work great. But it's something that allows you to manage that local account without having, again, a lot of setup and a lot of process, and doing it all self-contained within Ninja, and then allowing the right users access to it, which is also really important. He said prior to running and having this script set up inside of Ninja, he ultimately just didn't have a way at the time to do anything about local accounts. They would be set up at device provision, and they were just always there. So with this, he's now been able to kind of better secure the environment, which is a +1 for me, and allow for just better access control within their system environment, and trying to reduce it to managed accounts as opposed to some of those local accounts. With that was the end of the content. I don't know if there's any questions, Jonathan?
Looking here, we got some other folks sharing scripts too. I mean, which is great.
Awesome.
Here in the chat. But yeah, I mean, if anyone has any questions, please do fire away. And Josh, thank you so much for stepping in there. Really glad that you were able to share what Michael's been working on, and still get those points across. But yeah, I mean, if there's any other questions, we got about 5 minutes left. One area that, while we're waiting for people to chime in here, one area that I see as another opportunity for scripting solutions and for system hardening is protecting those browsers, right? It's not just the LSAS is not the only place where credentials can be stored. One additional resource that we'll share tomorrow is our endpoint hardening guide, which makes some other recommendations and also points in the direction of some other scripts as well. But I'm just curious with if there's anything you have to say about the browser caching, some solutions there, or anything else that you've seen that you think would be a good topic.
I mean, it goes back to the hardening point, which is configuration, and whether you do or do not want to even allow the browser's password manager to even be active or not. So being able to define whether it should or should not be used, because you want to manage some of those credentials in some cases if they're business credentials. You want to have supported systems being the thing that's holding on to a end user's credentials for business needs. Now, their personal needs are completely separate, but if they're on a work device, we got to handle it appropriately, and making sure that browser vulnerabilities are not going to impact and make you lose potentially sensitive credentials. So it goes back to true hardening, configuration management, which you can do through scripting and through Ninja as well, with a handful of different options that you have at your fingertips, be it Microsoft Edge, Chrome, or Firefox, which are really the main browsers I think most are using, with the exception of some on this call where you might have some others like Brave and others set it to use. But yeah, it's definitely a configuration item for me. And I think shameful plug with some of the MDM features that we have coming forward, with mobile device management more specifically, but maybe what that brings to our agent devices will allow for even more out-of-the-box configuration coming within the next year or so.
Soon, very soon. Okay, so we have a couple of questions. Oh, a very serious one too. Well, let's get to the first ones first. Is there a way to control settings in a browser without using GPO easily?
Well, you added in that last word. Easily is tricky. Google does have some ways to manage it within their own access. So you can subscribe a Google browser to be managed centrally within a Google account. Those are some options, but I imagine you've got Microsoft Edge on most of your Windows devices that you need to manage in addition to other browsers. There are some scripts you can run locally on devices for Firefox, and with Microsoft Edge. A lot of that is going to be browser-based, or not browser, registry-based. That's ultimately what a GPO is doing. So there are some wrappers to manage that locally. I've also had conversations with customers who are using tools like LGPO, which is local group policy object management. So it allows you to use effectively any script engine, which could be Ninja delivering it to the devices to manage local policy. So it doesn't have to be on a domain. You can use one policy anywhere and implement it with LGPO, which is a nice alternative to having to manage group policy. And then soon enough, we'll have some additional configuration options through MDM and others.
Nice. Awesome. A couple more minutes and questions are coming in now. So let's see. Well, let's get to the important one right away. Important question. Is the Nolan Ryan autograph poster actually authentic, or did a bad actor steal his credentials?
As far as I know, I may be spoofed on it, but it is authentic. My wife actually bought me that for her birthday present years back.
Oh man, amazing.
Best baseball player.
Amazing. Yeah, he didn't no limiting his innings, right? Didn't he pitch like every single inning for like
you will never see another like him as far as the amount of innings pitched, that's for sure. We're a little nicer to our pitchers' arms these days.
Well, great. I mean, that the browser discussion is really going on in the chat, but Josh, I think we're right about time here instead of going into another deep dive on anything. But wow, thank you so much for coming on, sharing your presentation, also these tips. Everyone, I'll just plug it one more time. Discord. In fact, I'll whip up a link right now. You can get in touch with Josh there. He's also active in some of our MSP Geek and some other Slack communities. If there's some additional features that you heard Josh kind of teasing, if you want to be kind of on the front lines of testing some things out, reach out to your account manager. But Josh, anything else that you'd want to direct people to?
No, watch out for Steven and his phishing attempts. Other than that, I think we're all set. I'm looking forward to the rest of the content today.
Amazing. Thank you so much, sir.
All right. Thanks, everybody.